Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our webinar entitled Mapping and Visualizing Lake Level Changes for the U.S. Great Lakes. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by Ohio Sea Grant, Office of Research, Ohio Supercomputer, OSU Extension, and several other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today are two experts within NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Doug Marcy and Brandon Crumweed. Doug Marcy is a coastal hazard specialist at the NOAA Office of Coastal Management in the Science and Geospatial Division. He's been with NOAA for 13 years, working on flood, sea level, and lake level map surge assessments and coastal hazards assessment projects, contributing to more disaster-resilient communities. Also joining us today is Brandon Crumweed, who is the Great Lakes Geospatial Coordinator on contract through the Baldwin Group at the NOAA Office of Coastal Management in the Science and Geospatial Division. He has been working with NOAA for 3 years, working on GIS and remote sensing projects focused on hydrology and the coastal environment. We're delighted to have both of them here today to talk to us about NOAA's new tool, the Lake Level Viewer. But before we get started, a few logistical issues. During our presentations, we'll be on a listen-only mode. Afterwards, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, feel free to ask those questions in the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will collect and pose your questions out to Doug and Brandon at the end of their presentation. We have more than 150 participants on this webinar so far, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentation. We should have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature located at the end of the hour, toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce Doug Marcy from NOAA, who will present mapping and visualizing lake level changes for the U.S. Great Lakes. Doug, I'm going to unmute you. All right, Doug, your presentation is up.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm happy to be here today talking to you about some of the work we've been doing to better visualize some of the potential changes in lake levels for the U.S. Great Lakes. What I'd like to do is just start by going through an outline of what we're going to present to you today, and then we're going to go through a series of slides to explain some of the background and climate issues, some of the Great Lakes climate science and historical water levels, talk a little bit about the need for visualizing potential impacts, and then talk about our Lake Level Viewer, a new tool for the U.S. Great Lakes, how we developed that, talk about, actually we're going to have a demonstration of the web mapping tool, and my colleague Brandon is going to do that, and then how to get at the data and the map services behind the tool, and a little bit about our future work going forward. As those of you who are from the Great Lakes region already know this, and some who have visited in the winter probably know it very well too, the lakes have a significant impact on the regional climate system. This is a great satellite image showing the 5 Great Lakes, the large Great Lakes, and how they really do impact the weather in the region. This is showing a northwest flow and the clouds and, of course, lake effect snow bands that do occur in the winter. The Great Lakes have a huge influence on the climate there. They act as a giant heat sink, and they moderate the temperature in the and also keep things a little bit warmer in the winter around the Great Lakes shorelines. This is just a graphic coming from the National Climate Assessment, the 3rd National Climate Assessment. The next couple slides, we'll talk a little bit about that. You can see the Great Lakes Basin here does impact the lakes do impact the temperatures and the ice conditions. Over the lakes themselves, it keeps the temperatures a little bit warmer. The water, again, acts as a heat sink. For the most part, all the Great Lakes are ice-free except for Lake Erie, that's a little bit shallower and does end up getting covered with ice. Of course, that depends from year to year. Last winter, a lot of the lakes actually had mostly covered, but for the most part, Lake Erie is the only one that consistently gets covered with ice. You can see that also the frost-free periods, there are greater number of frost-free periods or frost-free days near the shorelines of the Great Lakes, and they also moderate the summer temperatures. And also concentrate precipitation in these snow belt areas downwind of some of the lakes in the summers due to the lakes actually stabilizing the atmosphere a little bit and producing less precipitation. And as we go forward into the future, you can see that looking at the National Climate Assessment, the third National Climate Assessment, which came out ago in May, there was these regional assessments in the Midwest portion, impacts of precipitation and temperature on the region. Extreme rainfall events and flooding have definitely increased during the last century, and these trends are expected to continue. It's likely going to cause erosion issues, maybe potentially some decline in agriculture, human health, and infrastructure. The Midwest, including the Great Lakes, will likely experience longer growing seasons, and potentially rising carbon dioxide levels will increase the yield in some of the crops. And lake ice is also likely as we head into the 21st century, and you can see in the graph here that the graphics, the average precipitation potentially will change, then the heavier downpours definitely will increase in some. In addition, the temperature changes will also be occurring, and that will have an impact on our ice coverage. So as you can imagine and see from the past few slides, there's a lot of different climate variables that impact the water levels in the lake. Climate impacts all of these, and it's definitely, there's a feedback loop of change one and another thing changes. It's a very complex system, requires a lot of different models. And ultimately, what drives the lake levels is the hydrologic cycle we learned back in kindergarten, and that is it's water out. How much overland precipitation we get an input from land and groundwater versus what gets taken out through transpiration and lake evaporation ultimately ends up with the water budget and determines what the lakes will do. Looking at the evaporation rates, this information comes from the Detroit District of the Corps of Engineers. You can see that the evaporation has been increasing, as well as the water surface temperature. This goes back to the 60s. This will definitely have an impact. What have the lake levels done, though? You would think that with all these variables and things increasing, that I guess some of them are positive and some of them are negative, because obviously they affect the water levels in different ways. This is an example of Lake Superior, and you can see they've gone up and they've gone down. As a whole, in all the lakes, they all vary. Some of the lakes are more controlled than others, so you see less variation. But this is a great graph showing that the variability, obviously there's a seasonal variability, but that's the individual bumps, but then there's longer cycles that occur. The red line through all these is the long-term average, and that becomes important for us later as we talk about how to map these different water levels. Again, looking at the past national climate assessments, the second national climate assessment actually predicted significant drops in lake levels by 2100. But the most recent climate assessment showed that the current studies kind of the previous studies, overestimated the amount of evapotranspiration. And so they actually predict a slight decrease or maybe a slight rise. And you can see that they're not consistent in that wording. Partially that's because recent climate studies along with its large spread in existing model results, have indicated that projections in the future due to climate change are still subject to considerable uncertainty. And that's just with the climate modeling. What we do as humans in terms of future development practices, land use practices, more impervious surfaces, things like that will also impact the amount of runoff that will go into the Great Lakes watershed. So it's a pretty complex problem. But that doesn't keep it from going up and down, and it has in the past. In 2013, we had record lows in the Great Lakes. This was from an article we had in the Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, which are considered kind of the one basin, same water level. We had record lows. But as we go forward, we see that currently the water levels are actually higher, or have been past year higher than normal, so they do go up and down. The low water impacts are that it can impact the shipping and power generation, some tourism. It's not necessarily aesthetically pleasing to have a muddy, sandy, muddy bottom exposed with a lot of potential, algae vegetation. Could be some odor with that as well. During low periods, carriers, for instance, iron ore, coal, and grain are forced to carry fewer goods because they can't have their draft depth as much. Also, as the levels recede, the marinas will have fewer slips, fewer boaters, so it could impact, again, tourism and accommodate the boaters, be able to accommodate the boaters' needs. But when we expose more shoreline, we could have it could be advantageous for the expansion of some wetland habitat, so there could be some potential positives to it as well. Obviously, with high water impacts, we were enhancing the existing coastal storm impacts we see with the SAISH effects causing bluff and beach erosion. This will just increase where we have higher water levels, and understanding these water levels, their distribution and the impacts associated with them has been something that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has really tried to focus on. So this project is funded, or was funded initially by the President Obama's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We feel it fills a critical information gap. When we were doing some surveys in the beginning to get to build requirements for this tool, we surveyed a bunch of folks through some funding through the NOAA Coastal Storms Program. 40% of the survey respondents said that the current data on visualizing lake level changes were inadequate, and only 26% said that existing tools were there. So we had a lot of good information, and I'll point to those in a second on the water levels and how to visualize the water levels, but not on a geospatial scale. There's a lot of challenges with mapping in the Great Lakes, especially the Great Lakes shorelines. First of all, it's a pretty large area. The Great Lakes U.S. side is the only side that we're doing right now with this particular project. It's about 4,900 miles of shoreline, and this is a great graphic showing how the lakes kind of stack up with comparing to the East Coast shoreline. It's close to 5 to 6% of the entire U.S. shoreline throughout the country. And that's quite a challenge. So our charge with developing this tool was to go and use the best available high accuracy topographic and bathymetric Lidar data. Lidar data is data that we'll talk about in a second, to build a seamless digital elevation model for the U.S. Great Lakes shorelines. We wanted to map lake levels below and above each lake's long-term average level to visualize the impacts of both flooding and for low lake levels. Photo simulations at local landmarks to actually see the impacts. Link visualizations to the historical water levels, the water level dashboard, which I'll talk about in a second. And also define, as we go through this mapping process, define where elevation data gaps exist so we can go and collect them in the future. Also, and Brandon is going to illustrate this, the access to the map services and the data behind our tool that can be used for shoreline assessment, long-term change, and planning purposes. So the first thing we had to do was find what's the best available topography and bathymetry data. Luckily, we had done some previous work on this in the Great Lakes. We were developing what's now called the United States Interagency Elevation Inventory, and one of the first places we started collecting this information was in the Great Lakes. So we could see there was a combination of elevation data sources. A lot of the data that we used in this tool are coming from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Joint Airborne Lidar Technical Center of Expertise, which has got a big acronym called JALTEX. But there's other sources, including Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding in FY10 for some LIDAR and Topo Bathy LIDAR in the Lake Superior region. So this inventory helped us figure out where is the best available data to be able to bring in and start building these digital elevation models. A little bit about topography and bathymetry. The LIDAR, which is basically collecting elevation data from a plane, an airplane-based system, essentially uses laser technology to send a laser pulse down and hits the ground, whatever it's the water surface or the ground surface, and return energy comes up and is recorded by a sensor. It's very efficient because you can do large swaths and you cover a lot more ground with airborne methods versus traditional ship-based methods. But that does have some challenges when doing this, especially for bathymetry. There are two types of lasers used to collect topography and bathymetry. Traditional topography-based LIDAR uses a red laser, and a green laser is used for bathymetry, and that penetrates the water surface and goes down, and the energy actually can hit the ground, hit the bottom and is returned. It'll produce multiple returns, and then you just filter out the water surface. But this is based on light, so you can imagine that if the water quality or turbidity is high, then the light will not penetrate and you will not get data. And that has caused issues in some portions of the Great Lakes. And this is just showing our digital elevation models. We do have gaps. You can see on the left slide here, these are the actual raw points, the green or individual points from the topography. You can see some of them on the land side and some are offshore. And you see this little gap area where the interface between land and shoreline is typically very turbid due to waves or whatever, and mud and sand, sediment input. So we do have gaps in those areas. We're not actually collecting data. The current data coverage we have in the viewer now and the first release, which was last fall, we had mapped approximately 3,800 miles. We still have a gap of about 1,100 miles, and we have a digital elevation model for approximately 7,800 square miles. And you can see here where some of the gaps still exist that we're still going to be working on. Within that coverage, we do definitely have other gaps. We have places where we have we have topography, but we have no bathymetry, mostly because of this turbidity issues. It's less common that we have bathymetry and no topography. Most of the counties do have topography now, and that's filling in quite nicely. But in places where we really want information, like in our harbors, for instance, this is the St. Louis watershed area in Duluth. The flooding information, we have the flooding information, but we are missing the water depth information, and we're trying to right now go back and try to fill that in, and Brandon will talk about future data collection efforts. We wanted to connect to the existing water level dashboard. This is a very popular product that the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab has produced, and this has given us a great perspective on historical water levels. And we worked with GLURL to make sure we incorporate that information from the dashboard into our tool, and Brandon will show that. And we're also using this long-term average as kind of our zero starting line, because the water levels go up and down, above and below that line throughout in the past, and will continue to do so. And one last thing about some of the elevation challenges. Obviously, all the Great Lakes have different elevations, the water elevations, as it goes from the highest point in Lake Superior all the way down through the Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario. So when we're communicating these levels, we have to use different datums. We try to communicate that in the viewer, and therefore we make you sort of select your particular lake that you're interested in so that the numbers in the viewer are relevant to that particular lake. So there are some challenges when doing that. I think that's a pretty good overview and some background. And what I'd like to do now, I think, Jill, is we're going to transfer it over to Brandon. He's going to do a little demonstration of the tool, and he's going to finish up with how to access the map services and data and what the future efforts will be.
All right, I just unmuted Brandon, and Brandon, I'm going to give you the ball.
Sounds good.
I wanted to let everyone know that because Brandon is going to be sharing his screen, it may be a good time for people to if you go to your upper left-hand corner of your screen, there is a view. If you look for view and the drop-down for full screen, that should allow you to see the viewer better. So I just wanted to mention that for everyone so they can see it a little larger. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Brandon Crumweed, who will be taking us through the viewer. Brandon, you are set.
All right, thanks, Jill. One other note logistically here, too. While I hope everybody's excited to explore the tool, if everybody could just hold off during the demo here, otherwise it might slow things down, on clicking on the link or until afterwards. Hopefully it won't bog down too much. When we tested it earlier, everything was working fine. Excuse me. So, wanted to introduce everybody to one of the first jumping off points for the lake level viewer, and that's the tool page for the lake level viewer on the digital coast. For those folks that might be new to the lake level viewer and want to get some further information, this is a great starting point. It provides an overview of the tool. The other thing as well is there's support information. Often there's a lot of the frequently asked questions, and we try to capture a lot of those in the support documentation, as well as describing the methods that went into actually creating the tool. You know, what type of modeling are you using? How do you define uncertainty in the data? And a lot of those questions can be answered through this tool page right now. So we'll go ahead and launch the viewer here. And so this is the initial splash screen for the lake level viewer. Again, the lake level viewer was developed using GLRI funding to provide a viewing tool for the United States coastline in the Great Lakes. One of the disclaimers that we want people to be aware of is please do not try to use this for any type of navigation, permitting, or legal purposes. Again, often we're using derived data to provide a more continuous picture. And so that is one of the things, too, that people often ask is, can we use this data for generating navigational maps? And we say, please refer to Office for Coastal Survey to get the correct navigational maps. So we'll go ahead and start with Lake Superior here to kind of walk through what the capabilities of the tool are and all the different functions that are built into it. So one of the first things I want to show is that, like several other web mapping applications, it has that very nice, easy-to-use interface. It allows you to pan and zoom in using scroll wheels, if your mouse is capable of that. You can also use the plus or minus to zoom in and out. And we'll go ahead and zoom into Marquette, Michigan for the demonstration here, just to show some of the different capabilities built into the lake level viewer. And so the first thing I want to show is that, as Doug was mentioning, you'll see this hash area. These are areas where we do not have data, and you can actually see the terrestrial by turning on the topography over here underneath the console on the right-hand side. We can also turn that back off. If you prefer to have just a basic map instead of imagery, you can also add that in as well, depending on the audience you might be talking with and what you want to show in the visualization piece. So we'll turn the satellite back on. Another option is to actually turn on this depth queue. And so we can actually put a pin in a given location. In this case, we're looking at the harbor. And as we start to adjust the water level over here, you'll notice that the depth queue pin is actually showing what that change in depth is at that given location. And we can move that anywhere along in the coastal area. And again, that updates accordingly as we go up and down in water level. So moving over to the left-hand side, this is where the bread and butter really is in visualization, in that we can actually adjust these water levels. And let me turn the topography back on just to show some of this. As we start to increase in water level, you can see it start inching towards the coastline. And this is what allows us to visualize, say, a 4-foot, a 5-foot, or a 6-foot change in water level. We can always reset it back to the long-term average by clicking on long-term average, and similarly, we can also drop the water level. And this is where having that nice new bathymetric data in the coastal area allows us to visualize the retreat of water levels and what new land areas might be exposed. So here we've dropped by 4 feet, by 5 feet, and by 6 feet. And again, if we look at this navigational, this harbor, we put our pin here, this is where it can be very informative for those small harbors and marinas in determining what type of a drop would have an impact on what type of vessels, or if they need to do any type of dredging in these areas. One of the other features that Doug mentioned was the ability to actually visually simulate the various water levels. And so again, either using the arrows on the left-hand side or the arrows on the right-hand side, we can increase the water level in the lake level viewer, and you'll see that using Canvas, we can actually simulate what that might look like at this given location. So in the Marquette Lighthouse here, we can see what an increase by 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, and 6 feet would look like at that given location. And there are several sites, and we're throughout the Great Lakes where we are putting these photo simulations to help people get that visualization across. And we continue to add more as time allows us to do when enhancing the tool. So let me go back to the long-term average. So while I've shown a lot with the lake level change information here, and again, each of these layers has additional information available through the question mark to explain the data and what you're actually seeing. Some of the other data sets that we actually include a mapping confidence. So let me turn the topography off for this one. And this allows us to better define that any area where you're seeing blue has an 80% or greater certainty that it will be wet. And so again, if we zoom in, there are some of these orange areas. So those are areas where there is some uncertainty as to whether or not that may or may not be inundated at the time. And that also is adjusted as we continue to increase water level and decrease water level as well. And so again, just a little bit of uncertainty, because we're not completely showing, again, there's a lot of interpolation that is done in creating the DEMs, and as well information in regards to the water level. Something that we've actually borrowed from the sea level rise viewer is what we call the social vulnerability index. And let me zoom out to show this data layer. What this is actually showing is population areas or parts of a given location and how it's related to a change in water level and how that could potentially impact the populations there based on age, poverty, and other population characteristics. Anywhere where you're seeing a higher color, such as this red, versus a lighter color of white or pink, are higher areas for being socially vulnerable. This data is very useful for people that need to make decision support thoughts or processes in regards to how an impacting increase and decrease in water level could have on the living population there. Similar, another data layer we've brought in is the Bureau of Labor Statistics to show employment. And again, the reason being is you have an increase in coastal flooding, you may have folks that are unable to make it to work, and how that could have a socioeconomic impact as well. One of the other things that a lot of people ask are, well, I'm interested in getting the data. And so this last tab here actually provides you information on where data is available for download. And so anything that is green is available. And when you can actually start downloading this data directly as a zip file for the depth information, the confidence information. And often people are interested in the raw DEM. And so if you click on this DEM link, it'll actually take you to where the data is now housed at the NGDC within NOAA. And so you can actually download this data and utilize it for other projects of interest, such as coastal erosion and nearshore hydrology. I'll also show a couple of other really neat features as well, is the share opportunity. Say, for example, we're interested in sharing this view and location. It'll actually generate a URL that you can then email to other folks so that they can see the exact same thing that you're seeing. Or if you're so inclined, you can share it over social media such as Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. One of the things where I want to show that this can be very useful, let me go back to one of selecting a different lake. So we select Lake Michigan, and what I want to highlight here is a very interesting case study where having this type of information can be useful. Let's go to the lake level change information, and I want to zoom in by St. Joseph here. You'll notice that you can see the tree line here. You can see several of the houses are located here. And more recently, a house was actually built out here pretty close to the coastline. So if we go to the long-term average, you can see where the current water line is and where that house is. What you'll also notice briefly in the background here as well is the high water marks and the low water marks. So we can actually do a simulation to show what it might look like during that high water mark. And so as we zoom in, you can see how that water line has approached very close to that house. And so this high water for Lake Michigan occurred back in April of 1986. We'd shown this to a few partners in the region, and they're very interested, of course, in looking at the data because this could help with different policy and planning initiatives when looking at, say, coastal setbacks, or again, houses that might be too close to a bluff that could be potentially eroding in the future. All right, let me switch back here. All right. So there are several different ways that we actually distribute the data. We distribute it as raster geodatabases via HTTP. We also do a lot of web mapping services using Esri's REST map service, as well as WMS or web map services for people to get the data. So you can bring this into, say, an ArcGIS Online project, and any of the data layers you just saw in the previous tool demonstration, you can actually bring across into a web mapping application as well, both desktop and online. There are a lot of layers to use. The lake level change layers are very helpful for folks. The uncertainty layers are also a data layer that a lot of folks are interested in. We're actually looking also to potentially improve upon the uncertainty layer at this time. The socioeconomic layers are very useful for people that want to study the socioeconomic impacts to water level changes in the Great Lakes. And then, of course, more importantly, where we have a lot of people interested are these seamless condition DEMs that provide a nice, one of the first nice representations of the coastal environment. But we are always looking to improve upon this. We have a four-pronged approach when it comes to the lake level viewer. We want to visualize water level changes at a screening level for educational and outreach purposes to start the discussion. We also want to use the web map services and other tools with other data. So again, you can bring your data together with this data to study a potential project of interest. We also want to get the data layers to use for hazards and vulnerability assessments, identifying those critical coastal areas where we could see further bluff erosion or sediment transport in the nearshore environment. And then, of course, use the underlying DEMs for other purposes, as I've already mentioned, stormwater, coastal hydrology, bluff erosion, and sediment transport. So what does the future work involve? Well, we've already gone back through and done a bathymetric data inventory, and we are now starting to identify other potential data resources. As Doug has already mentioned, for the first go-around, we used just the airborne Topo Bathy Lidar, but we understand that we're going to have to use other platforms like multi-beam sonar and other acoustic shipborne platforms to collect data in highly turbid environments, as well as in deeper water. We are going to update with new Topo Bathy data and start filling in some of these gaps, such as the image here showing the St. Louis River Harbor, Duluth and Superior Harbor Twin Ports area. And again, we are looking for feedback from users of the tool and the data, and we use that feedback to help to improve the next version. And so we are still always actively listening to folks' input in what to do for the further enhancements. And then again, based on those enhancements, or that feedback, we'll develop the enhancement for management applications down the road and incorporate other data sets potentially into the tool to improve the visualization experience. Here's just a snapshot right now of some of the work that's going on. So these are some of the updates that are underway. One of the bigger data gaps that Doug had shown previously was the Lake Huron northern section here between Mackinac City and Saginaw Bay. So we are going to start incorporating that data into the viewer. We are also incorporating a lot of data for the Green Bay part of Wisconsin in Lake Michigan into the data, or into the viewer and the data as well. So here's just a list of resources. I know that this is being recorded and will be shared out, and so we wanted to make sure that everybody's aware of where to go for the lake level viewer, the digital coast, the U.S. Interagency Elevation Inventory. As Doug had previously mentioned, that's where a lot of the raw data that's used in the tool can be found. We also have a link to coastal LiDAR data so people can become more familiar with that technology. Canvas is a free and open software solution that people can use to create some more of these photo simulations that are very helpful when talking about these changes with the public and the decision makers. And then, of course, we want to point back to the GLERL water level dashboard, which we linked to show those average, high, and low water marks.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. Okay, Doug, you are there, right?
Yes.
Good, okay. We have gotten quite a few questions, and so let me just start asking. I think these were, Brandon, when you were starting to show the viewer, so let me ask these, and then Doug, if you want to chime in, you can as well. First question is, how were the society and business layers identified as important features? And then also stakeholder interaction was a question she had. Was it because of stakeholder interaction?
I think I can answer that. This is Doug. So part of it is that the Societal Vulnerability Index or Social Vulnerability Index that Brandon showed, that's a data set that we also had included into our national. We have another tool. It's called a Sea Level Rise Viewer and Sea Level Rise and Coastal Impacts Viewer, which maps sea level rise impacts, coastal flooding impacts around the country on the ocean side. And that tool brings in the Social Vulnerability Index information. So part of it was to be consistent with what we're doing there. That layer is coming from a methodology developed by the University of South Carolina and is currently at the census tract level. The business information, we're actually in the process of working with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get a refinement of that at the tract level as well. That is something that we're starting to develop a relationship with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and people wanted to look at what the potential impacts were of the number of employees that could potentially be impacted. Part of our constraint on these data sets is they have to be national and available, obviously available everywhere, and we don't have the ability to bring in like local data that, for instance, specific county information. This becomes too much of a resource to include all the local data sets. So, but we did do a lot of stakeholder engagement. Initially, we had what was going to be an actual workshop. Ended up being a virtual workshop, but we did get a lot of input into in the requirements process. We also conducted some interviews. We were working with Wisconsin Sea Grant, David Hart and his colleague Rob Roth at the university there helped us conduct some interviews and did some use cases of different types of users to give us input into the development of it. So the idea of using the map services and bringing this information or downloading the data to bring it into your local GIS with your local layers is what we encourage. We don't have the ability to do that everywhere, to bring in all these local data sets into a national viewer like this. So we kind of had to pick and choose what we show in there. And the idea here is just to overlay and start to show the impact of society and economics as a sort of a cursory screening level and not to do a robust analysis.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Another question that we had was for the data download, is it just a file of all the data, or do you have the ability to generate specific subsets if the user desires?
So, Doug, I'll go ahead and take that one on. As far as the data downloads, yeah, the zip file will actually contain, when you download, say, the depth information, it is all of all 13 layers. So the plus 6 feet, the minus 6 feet, and of course the long-term average for that information. If you're interested in just a particular layer to look at, then I'd actually suggest using the REST API service because then you can just select one layer to view or look at. But yeah, we do package it all together. The DEMs are actually broke up into tiles across the Great Lakes. So, for example, I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, Lake Superior is 7 different tiles, and similarly, Michigan is broken up into tiles that actually coordinate with the weather forecast offices within NOAA. And then, of course, the other lakes are much easier because they're a smaller file size in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. One question that someone had was clarification. Is it, quote, data or model information that is being used?
So this is Brandon. I can touch on this, and Doug definitely follow up. When we talk about modeling, the modeling part of it is actually the way the depth grids are created. So we actually use a bathtub model. Basically, everything across the board raises at the same water level. And again, that's why you have to be very specific about which lake you use in the viewer. And then, could you repeat the second part of that, Jill?
Is it data or model information that is being used?
And so, yeah, the data side of things is the elevation information. So the Lidar data is collected, and then that's interpolated to create a DEM, a digital elevation model. So again, there's the other side of modeling, but it is data. As far as modeling, there's no actual, physical modeling that's occurring other than just doing that bathtub approach to the water levels. Doug, is there anything you want to add onto that?
That's a pretty good description. Also, the water level data that the datums is another data piece, and showing the long-term average, the current water level, the highs and the lows in there, that's coming directly from the water level dashboard, and we actually have a data service that pulls that information in. So every month there's a group, it's actually an international group that looks at the water levels. So on the Canadian side, they're involved as well. Now, we don't do the mapping on the Canadian side, but they do jointly work on what the monthly water levels are, and that information gets pulled in as a service and gets displayed here. So the water level information's in there as well, but maybe the confusion is when we say digital elevation model, it is a model of the ground or the elevation surface or the bathymetry as well. So there is an art to filling in gaps where there isn't data and whatnot, and that's part of what we call a conditioning process. But getting the base layer elevation data set as good as we can get it before we start doing the mapping is a crucial component. But like Brandon says, this is raising and lowering the water on a sunny day, essentially. It's not looking at wind-driven surge, stage effects, anything like that, or any type of sedimentation processes. It's strictly to look at what would happen in a changing shoreline situation.
Okay, thanks, Doug. We had a question dealing with, did assessment of flooding consider any shoreline protection structures? And if it did, how would you estimate lifespan of shoreline structures?
You want me to take that one, Brandon?
Yeah, if you want to start, Doug.
So, again, I think I kind of answered it in the last response, as that we're not taking into account the erosional processes or wave run-up processes that occur during storms. There are other studies going on to look at that. For instance, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is involved in updating the flood insurance studies for the Great Lakes. Those studies do rely on hydrodynamic modeling and wave impacts and on the coast for individual storm events. And so things like shoreline hardening, seawalls, things like that would be taken into account. In this situation, in our view, we're doing, as Brandon said, a bathtub approach. So we are looking at if it is sort of connected to the ocean now. When we expand the water levels inland, we basically try to connect that to see if it's going to be impacted. But it does not take into account what the human response would be in terms of existing or new seawalls or revetments. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Doug. And again, often the question that gets asked is the hydrological connectivity to, say, for example, wetlands or water behind, say, a barrier island. We do not take into account dikes, culverts, or other hydraulic features in consideration of this approach. Again, it's a very simple step in doing some of this visualization. For those folks that are interested in that, that's why we do make the data available, so that they can take it the next step further to put it into those hydrodynamic models that Doug was talking about, or the hydraulic and hydrology models that people often work with as well.
Thanks, Brandon. Another question, is there any coordination with FEMA Great Lakes floodplain management update in terms of data collection, Lidar, particularly for embayment?
Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one, Doug. So we do work with FEMA in identifying where they are collecting data in the past. That's actually part of the work that we're doing right now as far as, identifying potential collection areas here in the future, because we obviously don't want to be redundant on data collects, trying to maximize dollars as far as the efficiency in collecting data. And so we do coordinate with our partners in FEMA, also as well with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, who's also involved with some of the work with FEMA in the updates here in the Great Lakes. And the other thing I want people to be aware of as well is, as we start to hear more about where they are collecting data in the Great Lakes, we actually add that in to the U.S. Interagency Elevation Inventory. And so, for example, I know that if you zoom in parts of northern Michigan, you'll actually see areas that show the future collects that FEMA will be doing for the Great Lakes, such as Barriga County in Michigan. So we want to be aware of the efforts that FEMA is doing, and of course all the partners they're working with on that, because again, the data they collect for that can be utilized in improving the lake level viewer. And then similarly too, we coordinate with the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA to see where we can help to start filling in those gaps as well. As Doug was previously mentioning in the presentation, is that's been a big part of the work we've been doing over the last couple of months right now, is being aware of those different efforts. So again, the Army Corps, FEMA, the USGS with their 3D elevation program and the updates that they're doing in collecting data also here in the Great Lakes region.
And I would just mention the elevation inventory that I mentioned earlier is a partnership with agencies like the USGS. FEMA has been part of that as well, so that we're basically trying to have an inventory of where existing best available elevation data is, so that all the studies that are going on will be using consistent data.
Thanks, Doug and Brandon. Another question that we had was dealing with whether or not this tool could ever possibly be used for like inland lakes.
Doug, do you want to start, or do you want me to take that one?
So a lot of it is depending on, I mean, you can map, I can take a stab at it, Brandon. I mean, you can map any shoreline if you have the adequate data that you, in other words, you have the data that is required. In this case, you know, we had to have elevation data. We had to have bathymetry information. So if an inland lake, for instance, had the surrounding elevation data and you knew the bathymetry, you could do a very similar process, is develop a surface, and then you could map different water levels on that surface. So as long as you produce a surface that has that information in there, you can do various water levels in a closed lake just as easily. And we've had to do this in our sea level rise mapping. In some cases, these inland lakes will be shown because they're not connected. We end up kind of keeping them out, and not as we either show them as areas, different areas that potentially could be impacted by closed basin flooding. Closed basin flooding is really they're kind of like small little watersheds that drain in on themselves and don't necessarily drain out to the ocean, and so there are issues with a lot of that. There's a lot of that kind of karst type topography in Florida that's particularly difficult, but certainly you can do this same process for any lake or any water body if you have the right information.
And so this is Brandon, just to add to Doug. So Doug touched a lot on the data side of things. In regards to the tool, the actual viewer itself, the code is available if people are interested in developing an application similar to the lake level viewer. As Doug had previously mentioned, the lake level viewer, a lot of the code that goes behind it and the creation of that was just basically the same as the sea level rise viewer, just adapted to the Great Lakes region. But that is using things like Open Layers 3 for those folks that do any type of web mapping, and you know, more of the open source side of things in creating that visualization tool. So like Doug said, as long as you have the data, and you can then easily bring it into a visualization tool like the lake level viewer.
All right, thank you. Another question that we had was, and I don't know these acronyms, so I'm going to just say these. Is there any intention of showing lake levels in NAV 88 instead of IGLD 85?
No, I mean, this is Doug. The datum that is used in the Great Lakes is the International Great Lakes datum of 85. And when we did the initial stakeholder engagement, it's one of the things we asked, and that's something that was a requirement built in that we also showed not only on the right side of the viewer, as Brandon showed you, is the relative difference between long-term average and adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 feet and subtracting that we also have the actual elevation values. So the feedback that we got was IGLD is the datum that we should be providing this in. There are conversions between IGLD and NABD88 that are out there if that's necessary for applications. And there's resources to be able to do that. But the data that you download would be, and the elevation data will be in, I'm pretty sure about this, it will be in IGLD. So that's something that was a requirement from the initial engagement process. Anything to add about that, Brandon?
No, I think you did a great job on explaining that, Doug. Yeah, if people are interested, yes, they can definitely go in and grab the data and do the conversion to NAV-D88 as they need for their project.
All right, thanks. Another question that we had, and I don't believe that you had answered this already. It was dealing with layers. Someone was asking about adding an ecological layer such as wetlands, submerged vegetation, or environmental sensitivity index.
So this is Brandon. I can touch on that a little bit. Yes, based on user feedback from folks in the field, as you can see, we did put in a couple layers of the socioeconomic data. One of the layers that we could potentially also bring across, and I've actually in the past demonstrated this through ArcGIS Online, is bringing in our coastal change analysis program land cover data, again, to show increases and decreases in water level and how that relates to the various different land cover types. And so within the coastal change analysis program land cover data, we actually do break out the wetlands into quite a few different groups so that folks can see the impacts on emergent wetland vegetation or scrub shrub or forested wetlands as well. And so that's one of the things that we're potentially looking at for the next enhancement in the lake level viewer, and it's actually in discussion right now. Doug, is there anything to add?
No, that's good. That covers it.
This is another one dealing with some of the feedback. Specifically, how did the virtual workshops and interviews influence design? What, if anything, changed significantly from earlier versions?
I can answer that. This is Doug. In the development process, we go through a process where we spend a lot of time up front on a requirements analysis and pulling together the requirements. We were in the stakeholder engagement. We did a couple of virtual workshops and received information. Part of that is to show an existing tool that we had. We knew that it was going to be based on, so we had an existing viewer for visualizing sea level rise. We showed that and said, is this something we want to do something similar to this? But we were also collecting feedback about what other functions and features it needed to have. We went through a process of developing what's called a wireframe, a low fidelity and a high fidelity wireframe, and that's basically a low fidelity is almost like a drawing of what the tool might look like. These were we worked again with the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant to show some of these wireframes to get an idea for folks to see what it's going to look like, and they provided input. Just as an example, to be able to show the topography, as Brandon demonstrated, to be able to turn on and off the topographic layer there and make it with a varying opacity so you can see through it, and you can, which is pretty neat. You didn't get a chance to see it in the demo, but if you go to look at some of the bathymetry areas, you can turn on or slide that opacity and see through to the satellite images where you can actually see some of the underlying sediment features, bed features, and then you could turn on and off the bathymetry layer and see that. That was a direct feedback from the engagement process. So we were able to show those wireframing products, get input on those, and then before we went into the design and the actual coding development process, we would hash through all of the changes that needed to happen up front so that they could go and code it really quickly and get it out. So that was definitely part of the process.
Thanks, Doug. One last question. We're at the top of the hour, and I had one final question for both of you. A couple people asked whether or not there's an example of a city that has already used this tool, and how did they use the tool?
So this is Brandon. I'll go ahead and start, and Doug can finish up here. So we haven't got any examples right now that we can think of, but we're always aware of, wanting to be knowing what's going on out in the region. So if folks are using this tool with their city governments or county government, definitely let us know. The tool was released publicly October last year, and so over the last 6 or 8 months or so, as people are starting to use this, we definitely want to hear back. And actually, one of the things we do is highlight that work through things like stories from the field that actually get linked back to the tool page so that people can understand how the tool was being utilized or how the data was being utilized in one of those decision support roles. So we're not aware of anybody yet. Doug and I have definitely been out in the field and providing people demonstrations and presentations on the lake level viewer, and we hope that people start to take a greater approach. And if it isn't meeting your needs, please provide that feedback as well, because we definitely use that information in providing future enhancements.
But this is Doug. I'd just add to that. People are downloading the data, and they are accessing the viewer based on our web stats, and we can track the number of downloads. We don't have a great way of figuring out how they're using it. We can't really track personal information. I do know with a previous experience with working with on the ocean coasts, there are a lot of agencies interested in changing water level information. Specifically, we've worked with EPA for their point source pollution outfalls, looking at impacts on that. We've had the Department of Energy looking at the impacts to some of their energy facilities. We've had DOD interested in looking at some of especially the Navy installations and impacts of sea level rise. So we're pretty sure there's folks going to be starting to look at this. It's interesting to track some of the web stats, and it's only been out, as Brandon mentioned, since October, but we've definitely seen a spike back then, obviously because it was new and we did a lot of outreach. There's been, I think, a lull when the lakes were covered with a lot of ice over this winter. Maybe people weren't as concerned about lake levels because they're pretty static during the ice season. So we'll be interested to see how it progresses into the springtime. Also, lake levels are going up again, and the low lake level issue isn't maybe not in the forefront of people's minds. Tend to forget the issue when it's when things change. So, but based on our previous experience, these are areas that we've had partners. For instance, the state of New Jersey has wanted to take our viewer and incorporate their own local data into it. That's why Brandon mentioned the code is definitely available to start doing that. It's definitely something we're going to keep tracking, and let us know on the folks that are on today if there's an interest, and definitely get in touch with us.
Thanks, Doug. And we do have a question in the survey that we'll be sending out to everyone about feedback, so please if you have a few minutes to start that survey and fill that out. NOAA would really like to get your feedback about the tool. We are at past one, so I wanted to thank Doug and Brandon for their willingness to talk with us today about the new NOAA tool, the Lake Level Viewer. Really an excellent discussion. And also a special thank you to NOAA and Minnesota Sea Grant for funding this webinar through a Coastal Storms Program project. I, again, want to remind everyone about the survey URL that is in the chat feature. If you could take a few minutes to fill that out. And also I wanted to refer you to resources and an archive of all previous webinar presentations, which are located on our changingclimate.osu.edu website, as well as our regional site at greatlakesclimate.com. This webinar series is sponsored by OSU Climate Change Outreach Team, and we'll host the next webinar June 16th with NOAA Coastal Services Center, who will be talking about green infrastructure case studies in Minnesota and Ohio. The registration is up in the chat, so feel free to register now. Thank you again, Doug and Brandon, and all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope that you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thanks again, Doug and Brandon, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.